Somalia existed back in 2004. It didn't just come into existence in order that we may go to war against it last week, in fact.
Yeah. Well, long story short on Somalia, the story beginning about 20 years ago is 1991, when the Barre regime was overthrown in a civil war. And it descended, as some would say, into anarchy. And there was warring factions and of clans and just strongmen in general. And then came 93 and Black Hawk Down, which is, of course, all Americans know about Somalia, is famine, and they killed our men who were there to allegedly to bring in food aid to protect UN workers, and, it was a humanitarian intervention, and it turned into killing hundreds of Somalis, and, 13 Americans died. And then, after that, it kind of cooled off, and the history of Somalia in the late 90s and really the early 2000s was one of increasing peace and prosperity. I mean, this is we're talking about Africa still, so it's very relative. But they had eventually electricity again and water and even internet service, and it was still pretty violent and poor society, but from what it was during the Civil War, it was much better. And then it started to go downhill. In 2006, the Islamic Courts Union took over because the U.S. was actually funding the warlords that had begun to be sort of marginalized by I guess what I would call an equilibrium of force, where there were just so many guns and so many wannabe warlords that they almost canceled each other out. And Somalis could pretty much travel. Yeah, sometimes you had to pay a checkpoint or whatever, but they weren't interested in fighting with you. That's expensive. They wanted to just make the money. So you pay the port fee, or you pay the highway fee to the strong man running the checkpoint, and you move on with your day, and you bottle your Coca-Cola and go on with your life. But there might have been 4 or 5 or 7 Al-Qaeda men in all of however many million strong Somalia, and the U.S. couldn't countenance that, and so it began funding warlords to root out this alleged evil terrorist presence that somehow affected the United States of America. And what that ended up doing is destroying that equilibrium of force and bringing the same warlords back into power. And so the Islamic Courts Union arose out of the outrage against this and smashed all the warlords, sent them, running away with their tails between their legs, and took over. And they banned movies and soccer and stuff, and that sucked, but they were not terrorists. But the U.S. hears Islamic and flips out and assumes that they're in league with Al-Qaeda, when really they're just a reaction, like most things around the world, to U.S. intervention. So that held on for about 6 months, and then the U.S. contracted Ethiopia to go in and just smash the Islamic Courts Union. They didn't go with a whimper. They fought back against their hated historic enemy, the Ethiopians, who are also Christian. It's just insane all around. And then the transitional federal government, this is the 14th version of this little thing that the international community has tried to set up, rode in on their tanks, or I don't know, limos probably, or helicopters going real fast so as not to get shot down, and helicoptered down into their little headquarters and sat there until now, basically, pretending to be the government of Somalia. They control, the road to the port or something in Mogadishu.
Now, I'm sure this is an oversimplification. I don't know whether you can clarify this for me or whether this
20
is
years, man.
Pretty much right. But, no, I'm not saying what you said. I'm saying what I'm about to say is.
Yeah, okay.
And that is that my understanding is that the Islamic Courts Union, upon whooping Ethiopia and driving them back out of the country, basically that Condoleezza Rice cried uncle and made a deal with them on the way out of the Bush years and said, okay, look, Islamic Courts Union guys, you can be the government, but you've got to be the government within the shell of this bogus transitional UN-created mandate ridiculous thing we're installing in Mogadishu, and that they accepted that. They made that deal, and now you actually have, I don't know all their names or whatever to differentiate, but you have at least powerful parts of what used to be the Islamic Courts Union are now the people sitting in the shell of that transitional federal government that the U.S. and UN and Ethiopia had attempted to install there. And now their enemies that are fighting the war are the al-Shabaab militia that never existed except in growing up to help the Islamic Courts Union kick the Ethiopians out and take their power back. And the al-Shabaab are seeing this compromise with the international forces as something they won't go along with, because they're not the old men in the neighborhood like the ICU were. They're young and full of piss and vinegar and with machine guns in their hands. And they're saying, why would you make a compromise with Condoleezza Rice? And now they're fighting the guys that they came into existence to help regain power. Is that right?
Well, yeah, more or less, yeah. I mean, they were part of the backing the Islamic Courts Union movement. But yeah, they're the younger ones, and they're always the, you'd read stories about the Islamic Courts Union, whipped somebody for, looking at a woman or something, and that's not the Islamic Courts Union. That's usually some crazy al-Shabaab teenager who has grown up with his country being bombed and invaded and embargoed constantly by the United States and the so-called international community. Mm-hmm. So they've created these psycho little kids who all they have is their all they have is their trauma, really, and
their Kalashnikov.
And their Kalashnikov, lots of them, yeah. And
Obama sent 80 tons of more weapons to the open market in Somalia, too.
Right, yeah, to the government, allegedly, but those will end up on the streets in a second.
Already have, yeah.
Even the so-called government's troops will just take them out of the warehouse and sell them directly to whoever. Man. But yeah, I mean, so what happened is the U.S. is funding the Ethiopians to go in there as their proxy to root out throw the courts union out, and al-Shabaab sees the courts union old men just go, oh yeah, okay, well sure, we'll join you instead. And they're like, what? Tons of us just died fighting them, and now you're joining them? And so that set off the al-Shabaab movement, and now they run some large chunk of the country.
Yeah, well, history began at the beginning of last November, and at the end of last November, Barack Obama gave his great speech where he promised that the beginning of the end of the Afghan war will be in July of 2011, and then for those of you who stayed till the end of the speech, he said, Somalia, Yemen, you're next. We're coming and we're going to kill your children. It was something like that. I'm paraphrasing roughly, but
maybe we could send that little police force.
And this has come out more and more, right? The Washington posted one big one, and the New York Times has done two big ones now, I believe both of them by Mark Mazzetti, or led by Mark Mazzetti, about the expansion of the covert assassination, JSOC, CIA war around the world. We're going to use a scalpel, not a mallet, they say. Like they're going to finally get it right or whatever, except, of course, a drone and a cluster bomb ain't a scalpel. But they keep specifically over and over and over again, they mention Yemen and Somalia as to make it feel inevitable to us that eventually we're going to have to put ground troops into these countries.
And eventually it won't just be inevitable. It'll seem to most Americans that we've always been at war with Yemen and Somalia. And so when they do finally send troops in, they'll go like, what? This has always been a problem. We've been telling you for a decade now.
There you go. And, here's the part, too, that always gets left out, is that this is the weakest, little, most helpless country in the whole world. This makes Saddam Hussein look powerful. This tiny, little, helpless country. And, according to Leslie Lefkow from Human Rights Watch, the last time I talked to her, there were 1.5 million people on the brink of starving to death. The UN has had to restrict food aid because they got no security at all. And the people of Mogadishu, there's a new headline today. Whoever was left in Mogadishu is now fleeing on foot to starve in the countryside.
Going in, back, trying to go back in, and then leaving.
See y'all tomorrow.